B. Collins.
Peter B. Collins, news and comment. It's Wednesday, July 11th, 2018. Here on the West Coast, protests have succeeded in causing the county of Contra Costa to end its contract with Immigration and Customs Enforcement. They will no longer hold immigrants as ICE detainees in the county jail. And I'll take a little credit for this. But the most credit goes to a young and resourceful columnist for the San Francisco Chronicle, Otis R. Taylor, Jr. He was the first to expose the inhumane conditions that immigrants were being held in at the West County Jail in Contra Costa County. That's just one bridge across San Francisco Bay from where I sit here in Marin County, which is just north of San Francisco, if you need help with the local geography. And we featured Otis Taylor in a podcast back in April. And I'm linking to that in the show file for today's podcast to make it just so easy for you to grab it and listen to it if you haven't already. And Taylor, acting on tips that he received from women who were being held there and who reported that they were only allowed out of their cells for about an hour a day, the cells did not have toilets, and the women were given biodegradable plastic bags to do their business in. That's just one of the most egregious situations that was exposed. And yesterday, the sheriff of Contra Costa County, David Livingston, announced that he is giving notice to ICE. 120 days notice is required by the contract to end the housing of ICE prisoners at the West County Jail in Contra Costa County. Now, they expect this is going to ding the county about $3 million a year. It may lead to layoffs in the sheriff's department. But I think this is the right move. And it's one of those balancing acts because here in California, like many states, sheriffs are directly elected by the people. And so they don't report to the county officials. Maybe they have to iron out budget differences with them, that sort of thing. But in many respects, the sheriffs are far too independent and have too much authority, in my opinion. And I'm glad to see that Sheriff Livingston is responding to the public protest and outcry and ending this ugly contract with the federal government. And over the holiday break, I collected a few stories here because we're seeing a federal judge in Sacramento, John Mendez, who ruled that the two key elements of California's state sanctuary laws are legal and constitutional and don't conflict with the supremacy of the federal government on immigration issues. And Mendez, like many other judges, is quite upset that the courts are being asked to deal with issues that Congress and the executive branch have ignored for years. And Judge Mendez wrote, if there's going to be a long-term solution to the problems our country faces with respect to immigration policy, it can only come from our legislative and executive branches. It cannot and will not come from piecemeal decisions issued by the judicial branch. And right here in Marin County, we've got a sheriff who flouts the intention of local elected leaders and the public, and he plays a little game where instead of notifying ICE that an undocumented person is about to be released from the county jail here, he posts it on a website saying that, gosh, this is public information, and if ICE accesses it, I can't stop them. His name is Bob Doyle, and I'd like to see that sheriff fall into line behind the sanctuary philosophy and laws of the state of California. Yesterday, some parents were reunited with their separated migrant children by ICE. But it is a sorry state, and the bungling of these issues goes beyond bureaucratic issues and miscommunication between ICE and Health and Human Services who get custody of underage minors. No, this is callous. It is cruel. And only about 1/3 of the 102 children who've been recently separated from their parents, were reunited by the court deadline yesterday. They had predicted that as many as half would be reunited, and that's just another sorry statistic of the failures, and we have to assume the intentions, the brutal intentions of Jeff Sessions' zero-tolerance policy, and that they implemented it without any consideration for the human impacts and having to return to the dreaded catch-and-release policy that Trump derided. It was used by the Obama administration and by predecessors. And there are no easy answers here. But Trump keeps going for the black and white, saying, well, if you don't want to be separated from your children, don't try to enter our country illegally. And he has no empathy, no compassion for the forces that drive people, despite the clear message of deterrence that's been sent. These people fear staying in Guatemala, Honduras, or El Salvador more than they do coming to the United States. And Dolly G., the judge in federal district court in Los Angeles, who was asked by the Trump administration to change the Flores settlement to allow children to be detained for longer periods of time, she lashed out as well. Defendants, she said, referring to the government, to the Trump administration, seek to light a match to the Flores agreement and ask this court to upend the parties' agreement by judicial fiat. She called the Justice Department's request to amend the settlement cynical, said it was an attempt to shift responsibility to the judiciary for over 20 years of congressional inaction and ill-considered executive action that have led to the current stalemate. So the judges are rightfully pissed about this, and they're doing what they can within the confines of their judicial duties and limits. Here's another case where immigrants who took a promise from the U.S. government and believed it, they changed their lives by entering the U.S. military. There are more than 10,000 of these individuals. The promise was, if they served honorably, upon discharge, they would be fast-tracked for citizenship. Many of these people came to the United States as students. They were legal residents. These are not in the dreamer category, and they are not people who are accused of illegally entering our country. But quietly, the Trump administration has been discharging these soldiers. One is a Chinese man named Zhang, and it appears his first name is Recruit. Maybe his parents knew from birth what they had in mind for him. So he joined the U.S. military. He swore an oath to uphold the Constitution. But after 2 years of delays, he has been given a sudden discharge. They said just one word, that I was unsuitable. This 30-year-old man has a wife and child, a business management degree. I see. Recruit is the name that the New York Times used after he requested that they not use his full name. So this is just one example of how they're pulling the rug out from under people who were given promises. And it just shows that whether it's the Paris Accord, the Iran nuclear deal, or personal agreements with immigrants who serve in our military, that you can't trust this government. Not under Trump. The NATO allies are getting just another reminder that they can't trust Trump. He went to Brussels, attended the meeting, came in petulant, and he unloaded on Jens Stoltenberg, who is the guy who runs NATO. And Stoltenberg, the diplomat, tried to just fend off the vitriol and the anger from Trump. He even went so far as to say that Trump's efforts to get NATO members to spend more on their military as part of the NATO treaty. Stoltenberg was saying, "Oh, Mr. President, your plain talk is having an impact." And so then the president kind of shifted and he attacked Germany, saying that they are totally controlled by Russia, they are a captive to Russia, and this relates to a long-planned pipeline that does have some political dimensions to it, a gas pipeline directly from Russia to Germany across the Baltic Sea that doesn't go through Ukraine. And while this would give Europe direct access to the very strong natural gas supplies that are available in Russia and being shipped in various directions, well, it also, and Trump does have a point here, it makes Germany vulnerable to manipulation by Russia. But what is really rich is that the guy who worldwide is accused of being a toady to Putin and that Putin controls him and that Putin elected him, he turned around and said that Germany is a captive of Russia. I think it's something that NATO has to look at. And he criticized Berlin for giving approval for Gazprom, the Russian energy titan, to construct the Nord Stream 2 pipeline, which is a $10 billion project. Now, Angela Merkel is a cool German cucumber, and she didn't directly confront Trump or tell him he's full of shit, but she could have. Merkel grew up in East Germany before the reunification. And at the NATO meeting, she said, I have experienced myself how a part of Germany was controlled by the Soviet Union. Now, united in freedom, she said, Germans can make our own policies and make our own decisions. She noted that Germany's the second largest provider of NATO troops after the U.S., has thousands of troops supporting the American-led effort in Afghanistan, and she was too polite to say that Germany has followed us into the blunders of Iraq and Afghanistan. And when you look at this picture, it is deeply ironic for Trump to claim that Russia is somehow a menace to Europe through these natural gas deals, but it's also an issue where he believes that Europe should open its markets to liquefied natural gas fracked out of the United States. And so Trump accurately noted that Gerhard Schroeder, the former chancellor of Germany, is head of the pipeline company. And he said to his fellow colleagues there, so tell me, is that appropriate? And all I can say is when it comes to conflict of interests, double dealing, fraud, it takes one to know one. And so Trump, I guess, is well suited to make that comment. Also, on the issue of NATO members' spending, there is an agreement in place to have all countries spend 2% of their GDP on military, but the deadline is 2024. And Trump acts as if it's already in place and that these are deadbeat members of NATO. He also, of course, exaggerates and grossly overstates the role of the United States in NATO. He says we account for 90% of the military spending, but in fact the figure is large. It's 67%, but it's just Trump undermines himself when he exaggerates in that way. Now, when it comes to this spending issue, the goal is 4% of GDP. And even though we spend more than any other nation on earth on our military, our spending on the Pentagon is only at 3.6% of last year's GDP. And Trump seems to forget that we formed NATO in part to keep Germany from rearming and becoming a world military power. And he ignores that by suggesting that Japan should have nuclear weapons, and he just bulldozes past the history and says, well, you know, Germany should also spend 4% on military. And I don't want to make it appear that I believe that Germany should be on probation for an indefinite future based on what happened in the 1920s and the 1930s and the 1940s. But Trump doesn't give a damn about that history. And the other thing I'll note is that I am not the biggest fan of NATO. I think it has been manipulated and abused into an extension of American foreign policy, and it has helped generate some of the conflicts that we have between East and West today. My bottom line is that there should be a rational approach to either reforming NATO or dissolving it over time. But for Trump to go in there with anger and invective and finger-pointing, it doesn't help anybody. And it simply leads to more destabilization and chaos. You may recall that at the G7 meeting, that was about a month ago, was held in Canada, and after Trump left, he got all pissed off at Justin Trudeau. He called him a liar and other mean things that Trump loves to do. So at the NATO summit, the Trudeau government announced a new military mission in Iraq. Canada will assume command of a new NATO training mission. Up to 250 Canadian troops will be posted to Baghdad to train and provide what they call force protection. And right now, Canada spends about 1% of their GDP on military, and they are committed to reaching 2% by 2024. But it appears that Justin Trudeau is not going to increase that in the near term as a way of sending a message to Trump. Gareth Porter is a distinguished historian and journalist who frequently gets interviewed on this podcast. And in a new article published at Truth Out, I've linked to it in the show file for today's podcast, he exposes the infighting in the Trump administration over the North Korea discussions between Secretary of State Mike Pompeo and the recently appointed National Security Advisor John Bolton. And Gareth notes that Bolton has been a hawk against North Korea going way back to the 1990s, when he was very influential in derailing the talks that were underway between North Korea and the Clinton administration. And what Porter notes is that the disagreement between Bolton and Pompeo probably led to the leaking of information from the Defense Intelligence Agency that you've read over the last week or so, indicating that Trump may have been duped, that North Korea is lying about its nuclear facilities, that they have continued to work on development and enrichment of uranium despite the showy destruction of one of their test sites. And I encourage you to read this, because Gareth Porter details how just before John Bolton appeared on one of the Sunday talk shows, NBC News and the Washington Post reported that anonymous officials were touting an intelligence assessment as evidence of North Korean intention to deceive the administration by maintaining one or more covert enrichment facilities. And because these media outlets, particularly NBC, are opposed to any kind of a resolution with North Korea because they feel it would redound to Trump's benefit. And I don't keep those kinds of scores. If Trump can defuse the situation with North Korea, even in his ham-handed way with fire and fury and tweets about little rocket men and all of that falderall, I'm willing to accept it. That is more important than the domestic political struggles. So check out Gareth Porter's piece. I think you'll find it fascinating. And speaking of Mike Pompeo, he's in Brussels with Trump. He was reported to be white-knuckling and silent through the meeting with Stoltenberg at the breakfast in Brussels today. But yesterday, he accused the Iranians of plotting terrorism in France. And we know that people who are Iranian citizens were picked up by the French with some explosives in a car. They were headed for Paris at a time that there was a meeting of the anti-Iranian terrorist group, the MEK. This is the group where Rudy Giuliani is a paid advisor, and he was paid to fly to France and give a speech. And I'm not in a position to say who these people were who were picked up in Belgium in a car with powerful explosives. Yes, they happen to be Iranian. But to blame the government for that? That is a reach. Of course, a little evidence could help. But we don't need evidence these days because the media is so complicit and compliant in just, stenographically reporting what official sources say. Now, speaking of Giuliani and his relationship with MEK, the Washington Post reported 2 days ago that despite his volunteer work as a lawyer for Trump, that he continues to represent clients in Brazil, Colombia, and the MEK. He has never registered with the Justice Department as a foreign agent, and he should. But he's not alone. His consulting firm also has a contract with the city of Kharkiv in Ukraine, and the mayor there has ties to Paul Manafort. This according to the Washington Post. But what is most problematic is the Mujahideen-e-Khalq, the MEK, an Iranian resistance group operating in exile that was formerly listed by the State Department as a terrorist group, but that changed in 2012 when people like Giuliani and Howard Dean on the Democratic side signed up as advocates for the MEK. And Dean, to my knowledge, remains on their payroll. So this is a bipartisan effort to sanitize MEK, and I believe it is an effort to put them in position to be spear carriers for some sort of covert operations in Iran that are contemplated by the Trump administration. Every day I pause for a second to thank the people who support my work here at the PBC podcast with your subscriptions. Great people like, Arlene Montemarano, the fine folks at Future Village who checked in for a 24-hour pass, Aidan McAleer, Auntie Lundberg, and let's mention one more, Paul Karsh just renewed his annual subscription. Thanks to each and every one of you for your support, and I invite others to match you. Come on over to peterbcollins.com. There's a menu tab. Grab it. Click on Become a Subscriber. You land on the sign-up page, and in just a minute or two, you can choose a level of support that's comfortable for you. And if you don't like PayPal, I understand. You can address correspondence, send a check, money order, cash, no coins, please, to Peter B. Collins, Box 150-660, San Rafael, California, 94915. That's Box 150660, San Rafael, zip code 94915. And I've got that great bonus gift for you if you take out a new annual subscription and give me a mailing address in the continental U.S., That would be John Dist's new rock and roll CD called American University. I'd love to send you a copy. Well, we have some great listeners to this podcast, and some of them share my views and even share some of the emotional reaction. I led the podcast the other day with notes from a Facebook post about the recent update from the Senate Intelligence Committee about the alleged Russian meddling in the 2016 election. And I was immediately attacked and called a Putin stooge and things like that. The other attack comes from Hillary Clinton supporters who continue to blame progressives for her loss in 2016. And Ian Berman, who is a longtime listener and a staunch supporter of this podcast, has posted a great article at Mint Press News. And his headline is a long one. This political hell was created by rigged primaries and horrible establishment candidates, not protest votes. And Ian notes that with the retirement of Justice Kennedy, there have been renewed finger-pointing from what he calls the Clinton pallbearers. Now, that's a great tag, Ian. I like that. And how they can't let go. And they want to blame Jill Stein, progressives who cast a protest vote for her. And, in a very rational and methodical way, Ian Berman takes down their arguments. He talks about how weak a candidate she was, the liabilities that she brought into the election. Quote, she had glaring faults such as illegally using a private email server for government business, refusing to reveal what she said at private speaking engagements, questionably selling access to the Secretary of State office for donations to her campaign and the Clinton Foundation, And one of my favorites, Bill Clinton's $66 million in corrupt contracts that were in place by Doug Band in anticipation of Hillary's win. Then he ticks off Hillary's deficits as Secretary of State: Libya, Honduras, Egypt, Syria. And he goes into much more detail here. I'm just giving you some bullet points. And also that after the election, Clinton did not lead the near instantaneous citizen revolt against Trump's anti-woman, anti-minority, anti-immigrant, anti-environment, anti-public education, and pro-war policies. And that when Jill Stein raised money to pay for investigations and recounts in Michigan, Wisconsin, and Pennsylvania, the Democrats did nothing. He recaps the rigged primaries, how the leaks of information from WikiLeaks were all verified as accurate, regardless of what path they took to reach the public eye, and that the accuracy of those emails was never in dispute. He writes, the DNC subverted democracy by rigging the primaries in what few would argue is effectively an exclusively two-party system. Instead of facing the fact that at least one half of our election system is in fact not democratic, the Democratic Party blamed our most potent military rival with whom we already have recently strained relations. So not only was the most experienced candidate colluding and undermining democracy, but to cover her tracks, she was gambling with world peace and nuclear war. So I think this is an excellent screed, and I encourage you to click the link and read it over at Mint Press News. I got a similar letter from John Zweibel, one of our listeners in Hawaii, and he reacted. He said that the comments from your stupid Facebook friends who are blaming me for Trump's election has finally provided the motivation he needed. So it's a lengthy letter with a lot of points. But let me summarize. He says, I have one agenda item: the utterly complete failure of the American economic system to rationally distribute America's wealth among all citizens. Obama ran on the promise of change. He was presented with the Nobel Peace Prize, for God's sake. Yet he and his Secretary of State continued not just to allow, but actually promote the immoral distribution of American wealth. Obama and Clinton are now both very, very rich. He says the only candidate who was addressing the truth that money makes the world go round was Bernie Sanders. Those who criticize his failure to address specific subsets I've listed are throwing sand in the eyes of the voters seeking to distract us from the theft of American wealth. Over and over again, we told you we weren't voting for Clinton, but you figured that you could bamboozle us with claims about how bad Trump would be, as if our lot would be improved with Clinton as president. Yeah. Trump sucks. So did Obama, and so would have Clinton. Then he gets kind of angry here. You stupid, ignorant, selfish Democrats who insult me by telling me I would be better off with Clinton as president can go F yourselves. Trying to restore a little bit of democracy, over at Who, What, Why, Nina Sparling reports that there are two activist groups that have decided, rather than to continue to try to challenge legally the voter suppression tactics, they'll work around them. So Vote Riders and Spread the Vote are two activist groups who are working in states that now have voter suppression laws like photo ID, and they're doing the difficult legwork, helping the vulnerable populations get the IDs they need to vote under these new and repressive rules. Here in San Francisco, we're installing a new mayor today. She is the first African-American woman in the post. Her name is London Breed, and I wish her all the best. I don't have any personal animus toward Breed, but she is the result of a system here in San Francisco where the tech millionaires and a handful of billionaires, working through former Mayor Willie Brown and the political establishment, have repeatedly suppressed the efforts of progressives to put one of their own in the mayor's seat. We had two progressives who split the vote in this recent special election to fill the remaining term of Ed Lee, who died last December. And London Breed, on the first round before the ranked choice voting kicked in, only got 36% of the vote. The two progressives together had 44%. But the Progressive Prevention Program, I knew I could say that, has been very effective. and Willie Brown is the guy at the helm of that system. There are two different cases in courts in San Francisco related to Roundup, Monsanto's product based on glyphosate. And that is the pesticide that has produced a wave of lawsuits. Now, in the federal court of Judge Vince Shabria, he is running a lawsuit of 400 combined cases. And he said that while he believes that the technical evidence that glyphosate can cause cancer is rather weak, he said that it is compelling enough that it should be included, and he declined to exclude it from his combined trial. That is good news, even if the judge is skeptical there. And it would these are preliminary proceedings that would ultimately lead to a jury trial if he permits it to go forward. Now, in a California state courtroom in, I believe it's in San Francisco, yes, a man who used to work for the Benicia Unified School District, that's in the East Bay, a 46-year-old man named Dwayne Lee Johnson. He is accusing Monsanto of hiding evidence of the cancer-causing aspects of glyphosate, and he is suing, claiming that his non-Hodgkin lymphoma that he was diagnosed with 4 years ago was caused by his job, which required him to use Roundup. We'll see where these two trials go, but I find them encouraging. Yesterday, the Senate passed a very weak and toothless measure calling for Congress to have a role, saying, please, Mr. President, if you're going to impose tariffs based on national security, can you kind of run it by us first? Now, this is a watered-down version of the proposal that came from lame duck Senator Bob Corker of Tennessee and is supported by his other lame duck pal, Jeff Flake of Arizona. And these guys have the right idea. They are alarmed at the way Trump is arbitrarily and emotionally imposing tariffs on allies and claiming that that is a national security threat. But it's a real indication of the way that the Republican leadership has yielded to Trump that they wouldn't pass a stronger measure. Good news for those who participated in the Disrupt J20. Those were the protests of Trump's inauguration in 2017. Last Friday, the prosecutors dismissed rioting charges against all remaining defendants. Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, is the phenomenal young woman who upset the Democratic leader and won the congressional primary in New York on Long Island. And yesterday, she won a rather interesting honor. In a separate race in the Bronx, she was the winner of the Reform Party primary. There were 22 votes, all write-ins, and she got 9 of them. She is declining that honor and will continue to run for the seat in District 14 that she was named the winner of in the primary. Nevada may host an execution tonight of prisoner Scott Dozier. But there is a federal judge who may call a halt to it because the company that makes one of the drugs that will be used to execute this man has said, no, you cannot use our medication to kill somebody. The company is called Alvogen, and they make midazolam. That is the sedative that is supposed to be used before Dozier is given a fatal dose of fentanyl. Now, that is the street drug that is at the center of the U.S. opioid epidemic that is killing lots of people. And the allegation is that the state of Nevada bought these drugs for an execution either on the black market or using devious methods. And speaking of devious, Sacha Baron Cohen is back. He has a new series called Who is America that debuts on Showtime, maybe this Sunday, I don't know exactly when. One of his victims, Sarah Palin. She was invited to come to Washington from Alaska to sit for an interview about veterans. Cohen heavily disguised himself as a disabled U.S. vet with a fake wheelchair and all, says Sarah Palin. And during the interview, she figured out that she was being had. She ripped off her microphone, exited the set, and for payback, She says the show's producers purposely dropped her off at the wrong airport. They dropped her at Reagan. Wouldn't she prefer to be at Reagan? Well, you can't fly from Reagan to Alaska. And apparently she had to call her own Uber to get over to the right airport, Dulles. Thanks for listening to my daily news and comment podcast. You're free to share it far and wide. And you'll find it on YouTube. I'm Peter B. Collins.
Happy trails to you until we meet again. Happy trails to you. Keep smiling.